As embarrassing as it is to admit, up until fairly recently I had no idea that Doom 64 was a main entry into the Doom series. For quite some time I assumed that it was simply a port of Doom 1 for the N64. It was only when I played Doom Eternal and looked into where it stood in the overall series that I realized that Doom 64 wasn't a port at all. Once I realized that, I knew I had to play it. While I don't think it's as amazing as some of the other games in the series, I do think it's entertaining and worth playing. With Doom 64 being a first-person shooter, the graphics and its visuals are very important. One of my immediate thoughts as I started playing was that the overall graphics look better. While that is true, I think I prefer Doom 1 and 2's appearance. It was mainly because of how different some of the enemies looked. Their appearance aged worse than the ones that were featured in previous Doom games. This is something I'll discuss further in depth later on. It's clear what kind of mood most Doom games are attempting to set. It's a general mood of fear of the unknown. Though it could be seen as a simple way of achieving that, utilizing darkness is very effective. Being able to balance bright and dark areas of the game was nice, but some areas were too dark. I'm sure that some may respond to that by saying, then the game's atmosphere would suffer if that was changed, and yet that wasn't always the case. I was happy that light amplification goggles were available to use, but at the same time, I was left thinking why not just make things brighter from the start. To me, it's either eliminate them or fix up the brightness levels. I could just do that myself in the options menu, but then the rest of the game would look off. As I played through Doom 64, I began to understand why I previously didn't think too much about it, and why some view it as if it's the black sheep of the Doom franchise. In my reviews of Doom games, I tend to focus on some of the same things, but that's because I feel strongly about them and think they're an integral part of making a Doom game what it is. I was surprised that the music was way more low-key than in other Doom games. I like the ambiance it created, but I missed the constantly present and pounding music, much like in Doom 1. Some may consider the music in Doom 1 and 2 to be repetitive and maybe even simplistic, but to me, it's iconic. Things just felt a bit weird for me to be aggressively hunting down demons while the soundtrack really didn't match what I was doing. It's kind of how Queen's Don't Stop Me Now initially felt out of place during Shaun of the Dead. In that movie, it was well placed because the music eventually gets to the point where it's upbeat enough to match the on-screen action, but the same can't be said of Doom 64. If you've played one or all of the classic Doom games, you pretty much know what to expect from the weapons that are available in Doom 64. As strange as it may sound, Doom 64 made me realize why the later Doom games would push you into using more than one weapon. Some may not have a problem with that, but with how the super shotgun practically takes everything down, that comes off as a bit cheesy. It was easy to keep using the super shotgun because of how effective it was. Due to that, I noticed that the shotgun animation wasn't as interesting to look at as in 1 and 2. That could be considered a nitpick, but since this is a first-person shooter, any and all things that could be done via the character's hand motions helps change things up a bit. It shouldn't be surprising that the super shotgun was as effective as it was, but what was surprising was how reliable the pistol was. It's the first weapon that's available, so I immediately noticed that it shoots faster than in previous Doom games, and I thought that was nice. In earlier Doom games, the pistol was way too slow. Besides taking down very weak enemies or as a last resort, it's not as effective. That wasn't the case in Doom 64. I found myself using the pistol more often than I expected, and I like that. For me, it's ideal to make it so that a game's weapons can be effective in one or more ways. It's clear that some weapons will be better than others, but if a weapon is practically useless against most of a game's enemies, what's the point of including it in the first place? It was surprising that a lot of the weapons featured in Doom 64 largely felt unchanged. They weren't complete copies, seeing as how enough was done to make them slightly different to what was featured in Doom 1 and 2. This especially stood out to me with the chain gun and how using it felt more intense. It could be that the technological differences between the earlier Doom games and Doom 64 allowed the sound design to make the chain gun sound more brutal. It wasn't just that alone. The screen also shakes a little, so I'm sure that helps. I just think it's great that a game that's as old as this one still shows how good it is. This is a small detail, but it's clear that a lot of thought and effort went into making the gunplay feel as intense as it should. I'd like to say that this was the case for every weapon, but it wasn't. Having spent the last few months or so playing Doom Eternal, Ultimate Doom, and Doom 64, I know that I use some guns more than others. As great as a plasma gun was in those previously mentioned games, it's not the same here. The plasma gun looks cool, but it doesn't sound as good as the chain gun. Rather than feeling as if you were in control of a weapon that discharged an overwhelming amount of energy, it didn't. If using the plasma gun in Ultimate Doom felt like releasing a strong surge of energy, in Doom 64 it felt more like a generic water gun. Attempting to get the feel and recoil of a weapon, especially if it's fictional, to be transferred into a mouse or game controller is difficult, but it's not impossible. It's not as if the mouse starts rumbling, but with some weapons you can feel that you're in control of something powerful. Don't get me wrong, the plasma gun is still good for bringing down tough enemies, but the feeling of raw power just wasn't there. I'm sure that it probably comes off as strange to be mentioning wanting to feel powerful, seeing as how I'm talking about a video game, but it's because other parts of the game contribute to that feeling. If you've seen my Doom Eternal review, you already know what I expect out of a Doom game. Thankfully, that was present in Doom 64. Up to this point, I've already mentioned some of the issues I had with this game. While all of that and more is true, Doom 64 was violent, fast, and filled with bullets all over the place. With that, I was happy. Unlike in Doom Eternal, I felt satisfied with the amount of ammo that was available to use. There were moments where I felt unstoppable because I could run and gun without having to worry about having to rely on cheap tactics or melee weapons to try to scrounge together some ammo. While that wasn't as bad here as in Doom Eternal, there were moments where I had to conserve the ammo I had. This stood out to me because that occurred more often than it did when I was playing Ultimate Doom. This is a Doom 64 review, but since I've played Doom Eternal and Ultimate Doom over the last few months or so, it's easy to have all of my thoughts in regards to each separate game spill into each other. I'm the kind of gamer that either chooses to play on normal or will make things slightly more challenging than they need to be. If it's a series that I'm unfamiliar with, I'll stick to normal. Since this is Doom and I've been playing these games on and off for quite some time, I played on the third highest difficulty setting. It could just be because of that decision, but I was left thinking that this game doesn't go easy on you. It was surprising to be dealing with a lot of pinkies right from the start, but I also took that as a good sign. It showed me that the game was going to be challenging yet fair. It could also just be that this was the standard for the time. It depends on the specs used in an N64 versus what was used in a PC back during the early to mid-90s. I'm sure that having better specs to work with allowed the devs to include more enemies. It was both surprising and unsurprising to see the number of enemies that would be directly in front of a level's exit. Previous Doom games would feature at least an imp in front of the exits, but in Doom 64, there was one level where an exit was being guarded by 3 barons. That could be exhausting to deal with, especially just as you're close to beating a level, but I took that as a way of keeping me on my toes. On the subject of this game's enemies, I feel as if I stand on both sides of the aisle when it comes to their appearance. While there were some enemies that looked great and came off as upgraded versions of what was featured in Doom 1 and 2, the Imps looked like a bad copy of Lord Zed from Power Rangers. It's not clear enough to tell, but it appeared as if the devs removed their mouths and that made them look strange. It's because the Imps from previous Doom games had mouths and their aggressive nature made it apparent that this was a feature included to make them stand out. By altering this, it just didn't look right. The problem with this is that it really shows the game's age. With Doom 64, some of the enemies, much like the Imps, left me aware of the game's limitations and I didn't like that. It's hard to mask the fact that this is a 24-year-old game, but with some games out there, they feel timeless. It doesn't matter if the game was released nearly 30 years ago, it still looks great. It's kind of how some 2D side-scrolling games, such as Castlevania Symphony of the Night, still look amazing, whereas some early 3D games from that same era look absolutely awful. While I did have issues with the appearance of some of the enemies, the Cyber Demon was probably the best looking one. It was because its look doesn't differ too much from what was seen in Doom 1 and 2. It looked more detailed without having to make any drastic changes, and I would have preferred for all of the enemies to have been handled in such a way. With other enemies, it seemed as if changes were made in order to freshen things up a bit. The saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, comes to mind. Besides how a handful of enemy types look different in Doom 64, I also noticed some were used more frequently than others. The barons in this game were like the cyber spiders in Doom Eternal. What I mean is that I encountered them way too frequently. I'm sure that some might respond to that by saying the game doesn't feature enough kinds of enemies to offer more variety, but it was possible to mix things up by having different kinds of enemies in one place. This occurred all throughout the game, but there were also enough moments for me to notice that I was facing the same kinds of enemies encounter after encounter. That was annoying, but it wasn't as annoying as the Lost Souls. The Lost Souls were probably the most annoying enemy to deal with. Maybe it's because their attack patterns weren't as predictable as the other enemies in this game, so that led to a lot of frustrating moments. Though these enemies don't look as intimidating as the others, what they lack in size, they make up for in speed and aggression. It was easy to take out Lost Souls with explosive weapons such as the rocket launcher, but the problem was that they'd come straight for you when you least expected it. 1 second they could be far away from me, and another second, they'd be an arm's length away. Like I said, this led to numerous frustrating moments because the rocket launcher also damages you if you happen to be close to its blast. Since I was sometimes low on health, this resulted in me killing myself and having to repeat specific sections of the game more times than I would have liked. The saying, "small yet fierce," comes to mind. In general, I'd say that the enemies in this game were well balanced. If I happened to die, it was almost always my own fault and not because the enemies were programmed to be cheesy. While that is true, the final boss managed to come off as fair, cheesy, and tough. It was because it required you to pay attention to multiple things at once. You had to work on shooting, running as fast as you could while avoiding some of the room's structures, and while also attempting to avoid two separate attacks. It covered both air and ground, so it wasn't as if you could stick to one over the other to try to sneak your way into a victory. The final boss wasn't impossible to beat, and I do admit that it was fair, but it for sure took me numerous attempts to beat it. The point isn't to just list off its qualities, because that's something that you can experience for yourself, but I figured that it was worth mentioning how and why it was a challenging yet entertaining boss fight. Maybe the point was to make things challenging in a completely different way, but some of the many switches in this game were hidden away to the point where attempting to find them was frustrating. I think that this was done to try to make the gameplay more than just running fast, shooting, and hunting down keys. I appreciate that, but the number of switches that had to be pressed in order to advance through some levels slowed down the game's pace. All of that gets in the way of what the bulk of the game is, killing demons at fast speeds. The contrast between slow and fast sections is what makes one more impressive than the other, but at times it felt overdone. Even with two different kinds of maps to look at, it was easy to get lost because you sometimes had to find a switch that was very easy to miss. It's to the point where a decent portion of my captured footage is of me going around in circles not knowing what's left in order for me to advance. Even if I was eventually able to find the necessary switches, I'd have no idea what I just opened up. It was because some levels were labyrinthian. I could see some players appreciating that, and I did as well, to a point, but I was happier when I was having to deal with waves of enemies rather than numerous and small switches that left me feeling frustrated. That's why it was such a relief when a switch I'd press opened up something that was within my line of sight. Rather than having to aimlessly search for a new pathway, I immediately knew where to head next. This wasn't always a problem because some levels were short and sweet. I think that it'd be best to describe these levels as arenas. What I enjoyed was that these levels allowed you to play however you saw fit. Doom's gameplay could be seen by some as simplistic, but making it so that something is both simple and entertaining isn't always an easy thing to do. All of this came to mind as I was playing a level that was pure chaos. It left me thinking that this is Doom at its finest. What I liked was that it wasn't large, but with how it was split up into 3 smaller sections, each section nudged you into changing how you approached playing through it. In the circular area, you could quickly strafe around enemies. While that was a viable strategy, the problem was that you'd eventually have enemies coming towards you from inside the level's corridors. When that was happening, it was easy to try to prevent that by attempting to corral enemies into the tight quarters. You could slow down the waves of enemies to a manageable crawl, but the problem was having to be aware of the space behind you. You could then go into the third and tightest area of the level, but the problem was that it featured traps that damaged you and your enemies. What I liked about all of this was that there were pros and cons to however you decided to deal with the level and its enemies. What I'm getting at is that having multiple options to dealing with a problem is always a good thing. Doom 64 isn't the best that the series has to offer, but it's definitely a good game and I liked it. It's easy to see why some may view it as the black sheep of the Doom franchise and why I assume that it was a straight port of Doom 1. At this point in time, Doom games can be enjoyed on just about any available platform. It's to the point where this has become a meme and it's both entertaining and interesting to try to get Doom to run on any and all electronics. I guess it largely depends on what kind of gamer you are, but if you're like me, you're open to playing any and all games, no matter how they may look or how old they may be. If you're a Doom fan, you owe it to yourself to play this game. It isn't too long or too short, and it's only $5. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.